Om Asatoma Satkamaya Tamasoma Jyotirgamaya Mrityorma Amritam Gamaya. May the Divine lead us from the unreal to the real, from darkness to light, from death to immortality. Peace, peace, peace be unto all. Our subject today is religion necessary? It seems too late to ask this question in a sense, and also seems even unnecessary in some sense. That if religion were not necessary at all, then religion as a force would not have been on the face of this earth for as long as it is. One of the things that we see, if we look at history, is that everything that exists for a reason. If something is totally useless, it just wouldn't survive. So the good and the bad, the beautiful and the ugly, all have some role, something to contribute to the world as it is today. And nothing is therefore totally useless. Nothing is therefore totally unnecessary. And yet, this is a question that still seems to be a question worth asking, partly because this is a question that I am often asked not only when I'm being interviewed in different forums, but even when I'm invited to schools and different groups, and oftentimes they ask me to speak about Vedanta, which I do, and then when there is a question answer session toward the end, almost always one of the earliest questions is, how and why I chose to be a monk. And that somehow seems to be a more interesting topic to discuss than anything about Vedanta itself. And it's something not so always easy to say. Many of the choices that we make in life are not always reasoned out in a very cold sort of way. It's like when you are in school and you want to decide what you want to major in, and your heart says, I want to do music, or I want to do arts, or I want to do this. And then someone asks, why is it that you want to do it? Not always you have been very cold and calculating in your choices. Oftentimes it is that's just what I like. That's something that my heart resonates with. And so that's often what I end up doing, telling people, it's not something that I had to struggle with, but it's just something that I felt would be worth dedicating my life to. Which is not to suggest that monastic life is the only way one can express one's interest in religion. Clearly not. Otherwise, religion wouldn't be what it is today. Religion and spirituality is something that can be practiced by anyone at any stage of life and through any of the various duties and responsibilities that we shoulder. Religion as a force has been among the most powerful forces known to human history. It is a force which has shaped human behavior. In fact, religious identification has generated staunch loyalty through history, a loyalty even stronger than that generated by family or race connections. And therefore, religion as a force, as a reality, does seem something that needs a little bit of thinking, a little bit of reflection. One thing that we see in common in all the world religions today, that they all claim a supernatural origin, that not that they were products of a human brain, that a bunch of people sat down at different points in history and say, let's start a religion. It never happens that way. Once in Swami Vivekananda's life, towards the very end of his life, when his mind was already withdrawing from all concerns, organizational concerns or concerns with the order, his Irish disciple, Sister Nivedita, Margaret Noble, as her previous name was, she once goes to school and goes to Swami Vivekananda in Calcutta and says, Swamiji, she was running a school for girls in Calcutta, and she wanted to discuss about the plans of how we can do or develop this project. And so she goes to Swami Vivekananda and says, we need to sit and talk. We need to plan this. And Swamiji was in a very different mood, and he just burst at her and said, religion was never preached by planners. And he says, all religion really occurred by, and then he mentioned the different cases. In the case of the Buddha, the Jesus, and so on, it was never that a bunch of planners sat down and said, let's plan it out. Which is not to say that plans are bad, except to point out that the origins, the founders, the prophets, the messengers of all the different religions have always claimed that what they discovered was not discovered through reason, but not discovered through a meeting, that it had a supernatural origin. So that brings up the question of how may have religion even started? What is the origin of this strong, powerful force we see as religion? Now, there are two theories which are current. And I'm basing mostly on a talk that Swami Vivekananda gave titled The Necessity of Religion. If you see that little book of his called Jnana Yoga, this is the first talk in that. It was given, I believe, in 1896 in London. And so Swamiji begins by pointing out that there are at least two major theories about how religion may have started. And those theories are, he calls it as ancestor worship and nature worship. So one theory is that the religion had its beginning in this, what we today might call ancestor worship. And it's understandable that when those who are near and dear to us, when they pass away, when they are no longer with us, we wish to keep their memory. We wish to somehow feel that even though they may not be with us physically, they are somehow present. If not here, then they are there present somewhere else, maybe in some different place or in a different plane. And which is why then there is this practice of making an offering or remembering or on whichever different ways of periodically visiting, say, the graveyard where the one's own are buried or cremated. So this idea that somehow even after the body is dissolved, that something lives, everything doesn't end there. That is the seed of religion according to this theory. Now, this was an ancient belief in many cultures. In ancient Egypt, for instance, this was very strongly believed. They believed that within this body, there is a body double, so to speak, very much like this body. So when the body dies, this double still survives. And therefore, and then they had this belief that this body double would survive as long as the body itself survives. That if anything happens to the body, any part of the body is damaged after death, then that double, the body double, the subtle part of the personality will also be affected. And hence we see all these big pyramids and the embalming of the bodies and the desire to keep the body as it is, because otherwise it would affect the double as well. This belief was also present in the ancient Babylonian civilization. In Babylonia, they also had this idea of the body double with one little variation, and that was that this body double somehow lost all sense of attachment or identification. It would not even recognize its own children or family members. And it would come and make demands. I want this food or I want that. And so of course, it generated a lot of fear that this person after death is not going to recognize us. So that was the belief among the Babylonians. We find this idea about ancestor worship clearly in China and many Far East, Southeast Asian countries, but primarily in China, which is even now today, you'll find that a lot of ancestor worship forms a core of the Chinese religious life. We find ideas of this even among the Hindus in India. This, the worship of, they call the departed spirits, the pitris, that was the Sanskrit word for it. So a strong case can be made on the theory that this ancestor worship may have been the origin of how religious instinct kind of grew in the human heart. The second theory is that of nature worship, that we see the forces of nature, the dawn, the hurricane, and the earthquake, the beauties of nature and the horrors of natural forces. And all of these raise questions in the heart. Not in every heart, obviously. It's possible to, today with our knowledge of science, it's possible to see and explain all of this, of how hurricanes occur or how storms come and so on. But if someone wants to look deeper and say, why do they occur? Is there anything beyond this? And it is this inquiry into the functioning of nature, the struggle to kind of peep behind what's happening, and not with just a very materialistic look on life. That is then what gave human beings the idea to personalize it, to personify it. And that's why sometimes we speak about nature being angry or benevolent. Greek mythology is nothing but abstracted nature worship. In ancient Hindu texts, we find many of the deities the Hindus worshipped were also deities associated with different forces of nature. So Indra, for instance, was seen as the deity associated with water or rain, and so on. And so the idea was, if we propitiate these deities associated with these natural forces, then the forces will be benevolent to us. The deeper idea behind associating or personifying nature was, as I said, not simply a materialistic look on life, but to recognize that the whole of creation was living. It was not just dead, insentient matter, but it was living. So every natural force was associated with a conscious being, a conscious entity. And that's how the ideas of these different which we today, of course, translate as gods, came in, the personifying the different forces of nature. So it's also possible to see that recognizing these great forces around us, human beings were wondering, is there anyone in control of these forces? Is there someone who is managing, making it possible for creation to survive in spite of the ups and downs? So a strong case can also be made to show that nature worship may have been the origin of religion. What Swami Vivekananda did was to show that although these two theories seem quite convincing at one level, but not also, they seem very different also. Vivekananda said that it's possible to reconcile both of these theories, that there is a germ of truth in each of these theories, and it's possible to reconcile them by seeing that the origin of religion is what he called the struggle to transcend the limitations of the senses. Again, at some point, some of our own ancestors realized that there is more to life than what we are able to understand. That in the sense that our senses are limited, there is for instance, there is a life out there beyond these walls, but if these windows were not there, you wouldn't even know what's happening outside. So how much our eyes can see, what sounds our ears can hear, it's only possible within a short spectrum. We don't even hear all the sounds. We don't even get all the smells. A dog apparently has a power to smell several thousand times more powerful than the human sense of smell. So our senses are limited, and today there is no doubting that they are limited. So the world that we see through the senses is a very limited world. It's not really the total world. Even the world that we conceive, the world that we imagine, is also very limited, because the mind itself is also very limited. And so at some point, some human beings recognized the limitations of the senses and of the mind, and then tried to go beyond it, tried to break that barrier. And we see that whether it's in terms of ancestor worship or through nature, personification of the powers of nature. The struggle is, can I know something? Can I have access to something which it is not natural, that is not normal for me to have access in my present limited state, with my limited powers of mind and senses? And therefore Swami Vivekananda felt it's very natural that the first glimpse of religion may have come through dreams. That's something that we all have. And it does seem, because a lot of these things we take for granted, it doesn't seem that remarkable that we have dreams. But just think about it. Centuries ago, before even so-called the modern education like the one we have was there, it was a very remarkable thing that even when we sleep, by sleep I mean even when the body apparently becomes non-functional, it doesn't move. Well, it's breathing, but doesn't move. Even when the body is non-functional, the mind still keeps on functioning. Even when the eyes are shut and this world is shut out, a new world does open up through dreams. It was not then impossible to imagine that if this is possible, even when we go to sleep, the mind still has access to another world, a dream world. Then maybe even when we die, the body is non-functional, but maybe we still have access to these other things. And of course, very quickly, human beings realized that it's not as if in dreams we have a separate independent existence, that most often the mind is only recycling the impressions it has stored and projecting them. But by that time, the search had begun, and the search was inward. And then we discovered, as human beings, that there were states which were even higher than waking and dream and sleep. Normally we say, when we discuss Vedantic topics, that we all pass through three states. There is a state of waking, there is a dream, and of course deep sleep. But very quickly, human being discovered, not just through theory, through their own experience, that there were times when they experienced states which were different from waking, different from dream, different from sleep. And it is these states which were different from all the kind of normal states, which then we began to recognize as mystical states. And sometimes they called it as inspiration or ecstasy, or in Sanskrit sometimes they called it samadhi. Whichever way you call these states, they were seen to be not the normal three states that we all pass through. And as I said before, all the founders, prophets, messengers of religion declared that they had gone into these states, the state which were neither dreaming nor waking, but something higher. And it is in these states that they came face to face with truths, with deeper truths, or a more profound reality. So when we speak about revealed scriptures, every world religion has a text which is often said to be a revealed text. Now these texts, which are seen as revealed texts, again, were not written down, were not reasoned out in the way we sit down and write a book. It was not a committee meeting. It was not a PhD dissertation. None of these. None of these were again, as I said, were thought about. The Vedic seers, sages, or rishis as they are called, they are seen as those to whom these Vedic mantras were revealed. In Sanskrit, they are called mantra drashtas. So somehow in these higher states, a state which was neither waking nor dreaming, a state in which they apparently transcended their physical and mental limitations, it is in that state that these deeper truths were revealed. And so this fact is recognized by all the religions of the world, that there are times when the human mind is capable not simply transcending the limitations of the senses, but also the limitation of reason, the power of reason. Now, whatever is revealed in these texts, we have the right to challenge it. We have the right to put them to the test of reason and not accept anything blindly. So although these truths were not reasoned out the way we reason out things in our daily life, they don't contradict reason. So they were not received or got through a process of applying reason, but they don't contradict reason. And that's, I think, very important to remember. The facts claimed by all these religions are all abstractions. And you can see the contrast, that as opposed to the discoveries of modern science, which are very concrete. Now, in the religion, all these abstractions take the form of an abstracted presence. So we speak about the omnipresent being, or the supreme being, or an abstracted personality. The most generic term for that abstracted personality is God. Or sometimes, among the Buddhists especially, they speak about an abstracted moral law. Now, all of these abstractions, whichever way we term it, sometimes we get caught up in words, and that is really a major problem. Or we get caught up in concepts, and then we may ignore the reality those concepts are pointing at. Among the Buddhists, a famous example that is often given is of a finger pointing at the moon. So, say a little child and saying, "Hey, look at the moon." And if the child then starts looking at the finger and said, "No, don't look at my finger, look at the moon." So a finger pointing at the moon is helpful, because then I know where the moon is. But if I then just look at the finger, then I won't see the moon. So that is what happens. Can happen, and often does happen, is that these deeper truths, these higher truths that were acquired in these higher states, through mystical states, when they are put into language, when they are put into words, you have to use language. You have to, in order to connect these truths, you have to have a conceptual framework, which is helpful, which is very helpful. But oftentimes then, we just get caught up in the words used to describe these abstractions, in the conceptual framework that is built to understand these truths. And then people start fighting over words. People start fighting over concepts. Then it's about like, my God is better than your God, or my this is better than yours, or mine is right and you're wrong. But we are just fighting over concepts. The reality towards which all these point, that is one and the same. And that is why, and there is this one debate, we have often referred to it on earlier occasions, is about the idea of self, for instance. I mean, there is a lot of talk in Vedanta about the Atman. Now, it's possible to discuss endlessly about the Atman, the spirit, and Brahman, and so on. And if our whole attention is got caught up in these concepts and discussions and arguments about them, there is a danger we may completely ignore the reality they are pointing to. And that is what Ramakrishna meant when they gave the example of a group of people who went to a mango grove and then immediately set about counting the number of trees and how many branches there are and the number of mangoes and the quality of mangoes and when the trees were planted and so on. And one person among them, he just went and plucked a mango and started eating. And then Ramakrishna used to say, well, that person is intelligent, that we have a limited time in this world. If we spend all of that time just arguing, discussing concepts, then we may never get to eat the mango. We may never have that direct access to that reality. And so about the Atman, and so therefore, there's one beautifully, it's described in some texts. And so the Buddha said, there is no self. Now that has become a long-standing discussion among the Buddhists and the non-Buddhists, especially Vedantins. It's like, well, Vedantins say there is a self, and Buddhists say there is no self. Now, who is right? Both can't be right. So who is right? And that can, again, go on in endless debates. Now, one way of understanding that, and the way that I particularly like, is that Buddha saw that people were so engaged in just talking about the self that very few were actually doing something to experience the reality of the self. And it was a very drastic way of breaking their attachment or breaking their attachment to that concept of self. And he said, there is no self. And of course, then people say, oh, there is no self. But such is the human mind, then no self became a concept. And then, of course, then there is a lot of, in Buddhist literature, it's like, no self. What does no self mean? And so on, that emptiness and so on, it just goes on. We just cannot but keep on making concepts, keep on inventing these categories. And so, and then later on, when Buddha saw that no self itself had become a concept, and then Buddha said, and this, you look, Mark, I don't have the reference with me here, but in one place Buddha said, it's very interesting. He said, those who are attached to the notion of self have some hope, but those who are attached to the notion of no self have no hope. Because I think he did it as to help people to break their attachment to the self. But what most people ended up doing is they just shifted their attachment to one concept to a different concept. And so as spiritual seekers, we have to recognize these concepts are important. The descriptions are important because they help us go to the reality. But we should never, ever lose sight of that reality itself. Now, why is it that we may lose sight of that reality? Why is it that we get caught up in these concepts and words and languages and these endless fights and quarrels in the name of religion? And that is because of a lack of renunciation, that our attachments are at the cause of all this. Our attachment to our ideas, our attachment to what we like, our suspicion, our fear about what we don't know, about suspicion of fear about what appears different from what we believe. All of this is behind this ignoring of the reality for those peripherals, yeah. And so the basis of all morality and ethics is really this sense of letting go or renunciation, which says, not I, but you. The more the I goes out of the equation, the easier it becomes for us to transcend our own limitations. The more we are caught up in the ego, we cannot then transcend. We still remain cocooned within our own mind, within our own senses. we'll have some glimpse into the world, but it'll be a very limited view of life, and it'll be also a distorted view of life if we begin to see that limited view as the whole. Even the golden rule, which is much praised, is probably not the highest rule, I would say. I mean, even when we say something like, do unto others as you would have them do unto you, which is wonderful, which is great. But even in this way of formulating that rule, the sense of I is still there, that I should do unto them because this is how then I would have them do unto me. The highest state would be this sense of I would totally go away. So the complete renunciation involves renunciation of this I totally. In other words, it means the one who has renounced completely will not even have this sense, I have renounced completely. Because if I say, I have renounced it, well, my I is still there. So then that would be the most natural state of living. We are spiritual seekers only when we are struggling to rise above our own nature, beyond our material attachments and identities. And that is possible only through renunciation. Now, renunciation is a bit of a frightening term. So sometimes I have often found that you say, oh, letting go, even detachment seems a bit formidable. Letting go seems, although really they are not very different, but sometimes it's called I think it's called the framing of a statement. For instance, I'll give you an example. Suppose someone has to go for a major surgery, and the doctor says, "Great, and how serious is the surgery? Or what are the chances? Or what are the statistics?" And if the doctor says, "Well, 90% of the surgeries, 90% turn out just fine," and then when we are told like that, then it seems like, well, I could be one of those 90%. But if you go with, and then the doctor says, 10% of these surgeries really could be fatal. They don't work out well, and the person can die. And then that puts a little hurt. But really, it means the same thing. So the way it is framed elicits a different response. And that's the trouble with all these terms. Let's call it renunciation, detachment, letting go. Our responses to these terms varies depending on our own personal history with each of these terms. In spiritual life, whichever way you call it, whether you want, whichever term you are comfortable with, renunciation or detachment or letting go, we need, every spiritual seeker needs this detachment or letting go. Now, there are two kinds of letting goes. One is inner renunciation, the other is outer renunciation. And inner renunciation involves the renunciation of this little self, the ego, the lower I, what Sri Ramakrishna called the unripe I, the I associated with things of this world, as opposed to the ripe I associated with a transcendent truth or a transcendent being. So, for instance, the ego that I'm a devotee of God, I'm a child of God, it's still an ego. You're still saying, I'm a child of God. But this ego is better than an ego associated with the material things. That's what Ramakrishna called it, the ripe ego. We need either this ripe ego or some way that our I has to be sublimated. And that is true for all spiritual seekers, whether we are monastics or non-monastics. The only difference for monastics and non-monastics is that the monastics, in addition to this inner letting go, there is also an outer letting go. And that outer renunciation can take the form of then going and staying in a monastery or a convent, taking a certain vows, and then putting on monastic robes, So those are outer in the sense that's something that's visible, that's something that can be seen by everyone. But inner renunciation is only something that we know inwardly. No one knows what's going on in our mind other than us. Now, inner renunciation, Sri Ramakrishna called it, the word that he used was Vyakta yogis and Gupta yogis. Gupta means hidden yogis. And Vyakta yogis means yogis which are manifest, which are open. And so every spiritual seeker has to be a yogi. By yogi is meant not the yoga as the word popularly understood. Yoga means someone who is sincerely striving to transcend the limitations of the senses. And so every spiritual seeker has to have this inner renunciation. Outer renunciation, only some people will have it. The outer renunciation does not automatically mean that those who have this outer renunciation have more renunciation than those who are only inner. That doesn't happen at all. Once M, or Mahendranath Gupta, the recorder of the Gospel of Ramakrishna, he once asked Sri Ramakrishna, what is the determining factor? How is it that some people join monastery, become monks or nuns, and some people don't? How is this distinction occurred? And one would have thought that Ramakrishna would say, well, if you have a greater renunciation, then you will dedicate your whole life, you will become a monk or a nun, as opposed to those who don't. But that's not what he said. He simply said, that is the will of God. And so, just because one is not in a monastery or a convent does not mean that person has less renunciation, or just because someone is in a monastery doesn't automatically mean that person has more renunciation. Because what is vital is the inner renunciation, which only each of us can know within our own hearts. And that's the crux of the matter. All the judgments we make about other people is only by what we see outside. And most of, I don't know, but think about it this way. Each of us can ask ourselves, how much of who I am is known to the world, and how much of who I am is known only to myself? And we will see that I would hazard the guess that the greater part of who each one of us is, only we know. The world knows only the superficial things, how you look, what kind of dress you wear, and how you move, how you talk, how you relate to people. And based on these external observations, people judge us. It's not that these judgments always are wrong. I don't say that. Oftentimes, the way we express ourselves outwardly is often a reflection of what is inside. So there is a connection between the two. And yet, it is the inner person that is of vital importance. It really doesn't matter. So devoting a major chunk of our time and energy to beautifying the external at the expense of the internal is probably not a good idea, because the real person is within. And if the reality within is bright and shining, it will show itself outwardly. So, in other words, it's so much more easier and more practical to be someone good rather than to appear someone good. To be an agreeable person rather than try to appear to be an agreeable person. It's much easier to just be loving rather than find out the ways to express our love. Because if we are loving, then that love will automatically express itself. You may not have to depend on, what was that? Dale Carnegie's, like how to make friends and influence people. The book is helpful, clearly, great tips. But there are still tips. Why can I not be a real, authentic, good person, by which everything that I do will automatically. So I don't have to appear to be peaceful and loving and unselfish. I can be peaceful, loving, and unselfish. That is the Vedantic approach. So the more the religions of the world try to focus on this inner person, the primary need to let go of the material in order to access the spiritual, the broader will the religions become. And the greater will the underlying harmony of all religions will become evident. The more we focus on the externals, the more divergent things become. The more we go inward, we begin to see that harmony underlying all. And that's true with us also. That's true with every community. That's true with the family, with every social groups that we move in. The more we look deeper inside, there are more points of commonality, the more points where we can share and learn. The more we focus on the externals, we'll find greater things to argue about or criticize or fight over. So, as we conclude, I would just like to leave you with this thought that we can, each of us, ask ourselves how necessary religion has been in our own lives, what it can do for us, what it has already done for us. I think it's periodically this kind of self-assessment is important, that we don't want to be doing anything in life just because everyone's doing it, or just because I have nothing else to do. That let us lead conscious lives, aware of how we invest our time and energy, that the things that we do, why am I doing it? It's almost like a cost-benefit analysis, you say? Something like that? I don't know this technical term, but it's a little bit like that. I'm investing so much time and energy into this. How have I been benefited? And if I feel I have not been benefited enough, is it my fault? Or is it the fault of the entity I'm engaged in doing? So this kind of a thing is very important. I mean, in corporate world, they do it all the time. And so we can learn. We can learn from them and they can learn from us of how we can make best investment of our time and energy. So it's oftentimes today when you speak about investment, people don't only think in terms of dollars and stock market. But time is an investment. Energy that we have is an investment, and therefore we need to find out how we are making. And if we are able to make good, intelligent, wise investments, we'll get great returns. You can try that out. Om Jananim Saradam Devim Ramakrishnam Jagadgurum Padapadme Tayo Shritva Pranamami Muhurmuhu. We bow down to Sri Ramakrishna and Holy Mother again and again.